2 years ago, my wife and I bought a small lakefront property for our family to spend summers away from the hustle and bustle, the city. As soon as kindergarten ended, we packed up and, with our 5-year-old son, set off for our new summer vacation home. My wife is a biologist and, luckily, could work remotely from our new location due to research she could conduct on the property. We're fortunate her career provides us the flexibility to live comfortably. Unfortunately for me, we've moved a lot in the last 10 to 15 years, but I haven't been able to stay with the same company for a long period. A small town near our lake home had just one grocery store, which seemed to be the main shopping spot for both locals and tourists. Fortunately, I'm a trained butcher from previous jobs in my 20s, so finding work was never too hard. I applied to the store and got hired quickly. There were 2 butchers on staff, myself and the store owner Will, who had hired me. For the first few weeks, Will seemed pretty laid back and quiet. I'd get to work shortly after 7 a.m., and he didn't mind if I was 5 minutes late. Will was around 6 feet tall with greasy black hair and a large nose. His small, beady green eyes and low, rumbling voice made him stand out, and when he smiled, his teeth looked unusually small. After a few weeks, though, things started to get odd. Will's temper would flare up out of nowhere. He'd explode, then calm down 5 minutes later. It didn't bother me too much since he was technically my boss. I thought maybe he had anger issues. As time went on, his outbursts became more unnerving. He'd say things like, "You better get this done before I leave, or you'll be sorry," or mumble, "Sometimes I think you'd be more useful to me if you were dead." This made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just managing in a tough love kind of way. I'd met other intense butchers before, so I figured he was cut from the same cloth. One day, I was 15 minutes late due to a traffic jam, and, since there were no alternative routes, couldn't avoid it. When I arrived, Will was standing in the meat cooler, staring at me with a large butcher knife in hand, his apron soaked with blood from the morning's work. I began to apologize, but he cut me off, saying, "This will be the last time you're late. The last person to disrespect me." He paused, took the floor, and then added, "Never mind, just don't be late again." In the days that followed, he was unusually quiet, which I didn't mind because it meant no more complaints. One evening, he left early, asking me to cut a few more items and clean the meat room. It was around 7 p.m., and as I was finishing up, I noticed something in the back corner of the cooler. A bone can, used to dispose of bones and fat, was leaking blood. This wasn't unusual for my line of work, but the amount of blood and the foul smell were unsettling. The can was also much heavier than usual. When I lifted the lid, the stench was overwhelming, and I noticed a strange colored meat inside, along with more blood than I had ever seen. Quickly closed the lid and left for the night, trying to figure out what I had just seen. The next morning, Will was waiting for me in the cooler, looking furious. With a crazed expression and the butcher knife still in his hand, he confronted me, asking, "What do you think you saw in that can?" He poked my chest with his finger and, in an increasingly hostile tone, demanded, "Come on, tell me what you saw." His voice escalated into a yell. That's when I decided I was done. Once someone puts their hands on me, It's over. What freaked me out was that I hadn't even really looked into the can for more than a few seconds. I don't know how he knew I had opened it. Maybe I left the lid slightly ajar. As I left, he followed me to my car, continuing to rant about the bone can. I drove away, and in my rear-view mirror, I could see him still yelling in the parking lot. A week after I quit, I woke up early one morning, around 4 or 5 a.m., to see headlights passing by our lake house. My wife was already at work, and my son was asleep. As I peered out the window, I saw a massive red pickup truck parked outside. The disturbing part was that no one was in the truck, and it looked eerily similar to the one Will always drove at the grocery store. I spent the rest of the night in my son's room, staying awake. By 7:30 a.m., the truck was gone. For the next few nights, I kept seeing that same truck driving around our block, though I could never make out the driver. After telling my wife, she suggested we return to the city since her project was nearly complete. A few weeks later, I had to return to the lake house to pick up some things. When I arrived, one of the windows was broken, and the inside was in disarray, as if someone had broken in. I reported the damage to the local authorities, mostly to document it, though I had no proof that Will was responsible. While I can't say for sure that my family was in danger, I knew something wasn't right with that man. Next year, we're planning to sell the property and move far away from that area. This wasn't unusual for my line of work, but the amount of blood and the foul smell were unsettling. The can was also much heavier than usual. When I lifted the lid, the stench was overwhelming, and I noticed a strange colored meat inside, along with more blood than I had ever seen. Quickly closed the lid and left for the night, trying to figure out what I had just seen. The next morning, Will was waiting for me in the cooler, looking furious. With a crazed expression and the butcher knife still in his hand, he confronted me, asking, "What do you think you saw in that can?" He poked my chest with his finger and, in an increasingly hostile tone, demanded, "Come on, tell me what you saw." His voice escalated into a yell. That's when I decided I was done. Once someone puts their hands on me, it's over. What freaked me out was that I hadn't even really looked into the can for more than a few seconds. I don't know how he knew I had opened it. Maybe I left the lid slightly ajar. As I left, he followed me to my car, continuing to rant about the bone can. I drove away, and in my rear-view mirror, I could see him still yelling in the parking lot. A week after I quit, I woke up early one morning, around 4 or 5 a.m., to see headlights passing by our lake house. My wife was already at work, and my son was asleep. As I peered out the window, I saw a massive red pickup truck parked outside. The disturbing part was that no one was in the truck, and it looked eerily similar to the one Will always drove at the grocery store. I spent the rest of the night in my son's room, staying awake. By 7:30 a.m., the truck was gone. For the next few nights, I kept seeing that same truck driving around our block, though I could never make out the driver. After telling my wife, she suggested we return to the city since her project was nearly complete. A few weeks later, I had to return to the lake house to pick up some things. When I arrived, one of the windows was broken, and the inside was in disarray, as if someone had broken in. I reported the damage to the local authorities, mostly to document it, though I had no proof that Will was responsible. While I can't say for sure that my family was in danger, I knew something wasn't right with that man. Next year, we're planning to sell the property and move far away from that area. From where we stood, we couldn't make out many details, but he appeared very tall and skinny, wearing what looked like a sleeveless women's dress. His arms and head were the only visible parts, and it seemed like he was hovering as he crossed the street. Jay and I froze. We hadn't seen a single car or person since we'd left C's. Now this. We watched as the figure moved across the street, disappeared into the parking lot of a nearby business. He never reappeared. We used this moment to speed up our pace, pushing forward towards Jay's house. We were only about 10 minutes away. When we finally arrived, the house was almost completely dark. Power had been knocked out, likely from the windstorm. 3 car alarms were blaring somewhere nearby, adding to the unnerving atmosphere. My heart sank as I realized something. Jay, I left my backpack at the gas station. Jay's face turned pale. Neither of us wanted to go back, but we didn't want to stay in the pitch-black house either. Reluctantly, we turned around and made our way back to the gas station. As we neared that house again, the wind abruptly stopped. It was dead silent, and I felt a sinking dread in my gut. Don't look at the house. Just don't look at it, I told myself. But as we passed, the wind slammed the front door shut, making me jump. We bolted to the gas station. Once there, the cashier seemed unfazed by our panic. I quickly explained that I'd left my backpack, retrieved it, and Jay nervously asked if she could give us a ride home, claiming we'd seen someone following us. She politely declined, saying she couldn't leave the counter unattended. We thanked her and stepped back outside, trying to shake off the fear. We told ourselves that the man was probably just some transient. The road was known for attracting some strange character. As we jogged back home, trying to rationalize what we had seen, we finally made it past the house without incident. That's when it got worse. The man reappeared, much closer this time, speed walking in the middle of the road towards us. It was as if he made no actual movements, gliding forward, his dress swaying with the wind. We broke into a sprint, but he kept following, disappearing and reappearing behind us. We barely made it to Jay's house, sprinting through the front door and locking it behind us. I could hear his footsteps scraping on the pavement. When I looked back, he was gone. Relieved, we laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear. The figure was too strange, too surreal, and it left us questioning what we'd really witnessed that night. I still don't know exactly what I saw, but I hope I never encounter that man again, lurking at 3 a.m. on those suburban streets. I was driving down the back roads, just on the outskirts of city limits. It was dark, no traffic in sight, just a few rest stops scattered along the way. I was on my way to meet a woman from Craigslist, already feeling a bit uneasy. I was speeding, as there were no other cars around. Out of nowhere, a man darted across the road, nearly in front of my car. It looked like he was being chased by another guy, who I didn't see until I swerved hard to avoid the first. While braking, my car skidded sideways and collided with the second man. The impact was fierce, though not at full speed. I heard a loud thud, but didn't actually see him get hit. My car veered off to the side of the road. First man had already disappeared from sight, continuing his run. He wasn't there when I got out, which should have been a red flag, but I was more concerned about the guy I had just hit. My hands shook as dread settled in my stomach. I ran to him, finding him on the ground, breathing heavily. Thank God he was alive. I asked if he was all right, but he didn't respond, just kept breathing hard. I pulled out my phone, ready to dial 911, when he suddenly said, "No, don't call anyone. Don't call the cops." His voice had a note of urgency. I stood there, phone in hand, flashlight shining on him, puzzled by his reaction. I asked if he could stand. Slowly he got up, limping slightly. In the light, I noticed his clothes were torn, and he had blood on his arms, probably from hitting the ground. He was wearing 2 layers, the jacket now shredded at the arms. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Do you have any cigarettes?" I nodded. "Yeah, let me grab them." I kept a pack in the glove box from when I smoked occasionally. We walked over to my car. I handed him the cigarettes while plugging my phone into the charger. As I fumbled with my phone, he asked for a lighter. "Hold on," I said, searching for. While he lit his cigarette, I asked, "Who was that other guy?" "Someone stole my backpack while I was sleeping," he answered. At that moment, I realized he was homeless. Guilt washed over me, and I felt compelled to help. I started reaching for my wallet, intending to give him all the cash I had. It seemed all right, apart from his bloodied arms, and his breathing was back to normal. Just as I was pulling out my wallet, I asked again, "You sure you don't want me to call an ambulance?" That's when I felt a sudden, searing pain in my face. Everything went blurry for a few seconds. I stumbled, my body swaying as dizziness took over. When I regained focus, my car was speeding away. He had punched me, then took off with my car. Left standing in shock, I felt for my phone, but then remembered I had left it charging. "Damn," I muttered. I checked under my jacket to make sure my gun was still on me. A wave of relief hit when I felt it securely at my side. At least I wasn't defenseless. I started walking, hoping to find someone along the road. As the miles passed, my feet. Eventually, I spotted lights up ahead. As I got closer, I saw it was one of those public restrooms. Nothing else in sight. And parked right out front was a car that looked just like mine. I peered in. There he was. Guy who stole my car, fast asleep. His arms were cleaned up, and the jacket was gone. He could have kept driving, but I was relieved he didn't. I took out my gun and tried to open the door, but it was locked. Every door was locked. I didn't want to bang on the window and risk him waking up and driving off. With no other choice, I took off my jacket, wrapped it around my hand, and smashed the window. Glass flew everywhere as he jolted awake, fumbling around. Quickly dropped the jacket and pointed my gun at him. "Please, don't shoot me," he yelled, instead of apologizing. I ordered him out of the car and told him to face the wall with his back turned. He complied as I backed away, asking where my keys were. Once I had them, I got in my car, glass crunching beneath me, and drove off. I never called the police, though. I had hit the guy and then pulled a gun on him. I worried about the legal consequence. especially since I had bought the gun off arms list, and the seller never signed the bill of sale. The last thing I wanted was for them to check the gun and find out the seller reported it stolen. In hindsight, I probably should have been fine calling the cops, but I couldn't shake the fear. And as for the Craigslist woman, I never met her. Just went home, alone. A college-aged female, and used to work at a unique Irish pub. Even though I lived near a college town, pub's main customers were men and women 40 and up. It was rare to see anyone my age. Pub was owned by 3 older men who would only show up to get free drinks for themselves and their friends, treating the staff poorly. They expected us to know their every order by heart. One Friday night, I had the closing serving shift. If my sections were cleared and everything was cleaned, I'd clock out at 11 p.m. It had been painfully slow. I hadn't had a table in over 2 hours, and I'd finished all the prep for the next day's shift. Nearing clock-out time at 10:55, I was exhausted and ready to go home. I was chatting with the other bartenders when suddenly one of the owners walked in with 30 of his friends. They came without warning and filled up my entire section of table. The bartender even tried to hide behind me so the owner wouldn't ask him to stay. The owner always demanded a server, even if he never sat at a table. There was a 50-50 chance getting a 20% tip for. But unfortunately, he spotted me and asked, "Are there any servers still here who can help us?" I decided to suck it up, thinking I might at least make some tips from the rest of the. Played my cards right. I worked that party hard. Nobody's beer went empty, and if I saw someone getting too drunk, I'd make sure they had a ride. I handed out water when I saw things were getting out of hand. Food came out fast. Everyone was having a great time, and it turned out to be an okay night as the group slipped me cash tips here and there. By 2 a.m., the night was winding down, and 3 men called me over. Despite being completely worn out and sweating, I approached them with a smile. I've worked in places like this long enough not to be too bothered by creepy old men talk, but I won't tolerate blatant disrespect. One of the men, a 78-year-old I'd served at least 5 beers and 2 shots to, started the conversation. First guy said, "Forgive us if this is a bit crude. We've been debating it all night and need a woman's final opinion. Beard or no beard?" I laughed and replied, "Oh, definitely a beard. I love my fiancé's beard." The second guy chimed in, "But doesn't it feel weird when you kiss him? Doesn't it tickle or catch food?" I joked, "Not as much as you'd think. It can get scratchy at a certain length. You stop noticing it. He keeps his clean. Do you want me to grab you a wipey since you seem to need help?" We all laughed, and the second guy said, "I might take you up on that. So if he shaved, would you be upset?" I shrugged. "Nah, it's his choice. It just takes some getting used to, but every girl's different." That's when the third guy, the 78-year-old, started running his hand lightly through my hair and said, "So, you like beards, huh? Do the whiskers turn you on?" I replied, "I wouldn't go that far," but he kept going. He wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close, and leaned in to whisper in my ear. I bet those whiskers feel real good between your legs too, huh? He said, wiggling his eyebrows at me. I was completely shocked and yanked myself out of his arms. No one had ever spoken to me like that before. He seemed surprised I was angry and tried to laugh it off, talking over me as the other two men, confused, asked what he said. I've dealt with creepy comments and behavior before, but never something so blatant. Furious, I told the other men exactly what he said. They looked disgusted with him, and I immediately told the bartender and head chef what had happened. Both were like older brothers to the waitresses, always willing to help, and they were livid. But before they could do anything, the owner gathered the group for a big group photo, including the creep, and they all left. The next morning, I got a bit of revenge. A large group of older women came into the pub, and it turned out they were the wives of the men from the previous night. When they found out I was one of the servers who had served their husbands, they asked me for detail. I felt terrible for the man's wife, but you could see the fury in her eyes when I told her what her husband had said. I'm turning 22 at the end of the month, and this event occurred almost 10 years ago. Despite the time that's passed, I still remember it vividly. It often comes to mind, and I bring it up with my family, even though it makes us uncomfortable. It serves as a constant reminder of how dangerous the world can be. A little backstory. Growing up, I always had very fair skin, blonde hair, and light eyes, features that certain creeps seem drawn to. When I was just approaching my teenage years, my older sister, who was 8 years older than me, was in the military and had been away for a long time. Finally, she was coming home to the U.S., stationed at a base in Kentucky, just a few states away. My parents and I were excited and planned a weekend trip to see her for the first time in years. Though it was only for a few days, we were thrilled. We had a great time going out to eat, giving her accumulated Christmas presents, and visiting a nearby mall close to our hotel. I remember how happy she was just to wear normal civilian clothes again. On our last night together, something felt off as we walked to the mall. It was one of those eerie vibes you get in unfamiliar places. The mall was nearing closing time. It was around 10 p.m. We wandered around looking at different stores until we entered one last shop before leaving. It wasn't a store we would normally visit, specializing in expensive streetwear. Like the pesky 12-year-old I was, I wandered around, bothering my parents as my sister browsed. Suddenly, my sister walked over to my mom and whispered something. I noticed a man with a well-groomed black mustache had been following us. Kept asking my dad, "Is there anything I can help you with? Or can I help you find something?" But his persistence felt strange. His accent was thick, possibly Indian or Turkish. Guess. My sister and mom left the store, throwing glances back at my dad with a clear, "let's go now" expression. I was picking up on the strange vibes, but didn't fully understand why they wanted to leave so quickly. I began to catch up with them, and when my dad noticed, he started to follow. However, the man stopped. Still close enough to hear, I suddenly realized what had been happening. The man had been staring at me the entire time. Turning from me to my dad, he asked, "How much for the little one?" My dad, caught off guard and thinking it must be some sort of tasteless joke, laughed uncomfortably. My mom and sister, still waiting ahead, didn't hear this exchange. "What?" my dad asked, hoping for some clarification. The man repeated himself, saying he wanted to buy me. My dad immediately shifted into protective mode, now fully realizing the man was serious. "We don't do that here," he said, his voice rising. He quickly ushered me toward my mom and sister, and as we walked away, he told them what had just happened. The drive back to the hotel was tense. My sister grew increasingly upset, saying that if she had known, she would have killed the man. Honestly, I'm not sure what we could have done at the moment, but the entire situation was beyond disturbing. Now, looking back, I fully grasped the implications of what had transpired. Needless to say, we never set foot in that store again.